Ernest Holmes, the founder of our movement, one of his greatest contributions to our movement into metaphysics and New Thought was a book he wrote called The Science of Mind. I think that a title that most of us can kind of bite off and understand is more like The Science of Spirit, I think, nowadays. But he saw God, he saw spirit as intelligent. And that's why he wanted that word mind in there. So that was important to him. This week, I kind of got in the science of mind, and I was digging around a little bit, and I have a concordance, and I was kind of matching some things up. And there's a statement that if you read the science of mind, if you read the whole thing through, God bless you. It's a thick read, let me tell you. It's not exactly recreational. It's really beautiful, though. And he repeats himself over and over again about certain ideas, but something I found that he repeats more than anything else, and I honestly didn't know that until this week. It's a statement that goes something like this. It is through the revelation of the self, to the self, that one understands life. It is through the revelation of the self, to the self, that one understands life. Now, I think about why was that so important to Holmes, and where did he get this from? And I think that Holmes got this from an experience that we have all had. And what I mean by that is, how many times have we been to a place, we're living our lives, and we actually step into a place. We hear a piece of music, we pick up a book, we hear a conversation, we hear a philosophy, we hear a presentation, we hear a provocative question, and we go, wow, I feel like I've come home. I experience this a lot, it's really neat that I get to experience this a lot here. I get to experience something that was true when I found this philosophy as well. All kinds of people who will come in here on a Sunday, or they will find, Michael Beckwith online, or they'll watch an interview with Oprah, or they'll hear a song, or they'll read something, and they'll say, wow, I feel like I've come home. And I feel the very same way. I felt like when I came into this place, and I began to listen to what was being said, and I went to classes, and I started reading some things, I felt like I'd come home. Now I want us to think about that for just a moment. I found something that on a conscious level I really wasn't aware of, I really didn't know it was around, and yet when I found it, I came home. Let's really think about that. You see, Holmes had the same experience, and yet he sat with that experience and said, because Holmes was the type of person who questioned, who wondered, had this great curiosity, and said, wow, what's that about? I heard something, I picked something up, I read something, I went somewhere that maybe I've never been, wasn't aware of on a conscious level, and yet I came home. How many times have we heard a piece of music maybe for the first time, and we find ourselves crying? Or we see a movie for the first time, we find ourselves crying. And not that, beyond the fact that it's a sweet story or whatever, but just something, and we go to talk about it, and we can't even catch our breath, or we find ourselves becoming incredibly emotional. I'm not a musician, but I've talked to musicians who say that there's times where they play music, and something that doesn't even have words to it, and they become incredibly emotional. There's a recognition there. And Holmes simply asks the question, what is that about? What is that about to find something for the first time, but yet feel like I've come home, to feel like there is something within me, this ancient truth. I feel like I found my place. Woody Allen made a movie, it came out in 2011, really recently. It was called Midnight in Paris. It's about this guy, and it's a romantic comedy, and much like Woody Allen does, has to do with relationships. But what's really neat about this movie is Woody Allen really kind of gets off into some magic, and he kind of gets off into some metaphysics in this movie. I've always thought that Woody Allen was a very metaphysical person, but He's one of those guys. He's a smart guy. He's a show business guy. He's intellectual in his own way, and he kind of jumps up and down and protests about religion, kind of too much, I think, sometimes. And when I say too much, is I think there are those parts of him that are incredibly spiritual. I think they always have been. He comes from that great, rich Jewish tradition. New York Jewish, being around that culture, that rich culture of spirituality and religion. So, Midnight in Paris, it's about a guy. He goes to Paris, and he's there with his fiancée, and he's there with her parents, and he's a writer. And the indication is that he's like a TV writer or something. But he finds himself kind of conflicted, and you get this in the movie. He and his girlfriend are in Paris having this great vacation. They're with her parents. They're eating at all the best restaurants. They're seeing all the greatest things. And he's a good-looking guy, and she's a beautiful woman, and they're going to have this wonderful life together. And but he has something inside him. He has a couple of conflicts, and that's kind of the center of the movie. And one of the conflicts, he has a couple of conflicts, but one of them is kind of this idea of who and what he is as a writer. And so consciously, it's about being a TV writer, being a movie writer, making lots of money, having a great life. I mean, that's where the conscious intention is. We would say in metaphysics, we teach, have that conscious intention, be very clear where we want to go, put a fine point on the way we want to live life. But then there's that other part of us. I had a brief conversation this morning where someone pointed out to me that we as people very often have contradictions that float around in us. I think that, again, that's a really interesting thing. Why do we have these contradictions? What do they mean? These questions, these doubts, these wanting to go in two directions at once. We had this conflict within him. And it was a conflict of somehow that had to do with his writing. And so the story goes, this great mythological story that Woody Allen tells is that he's out one night taking a walk, and he's somewhere in Paris. I don't know Paris that well, but some famous place where there's a clock, and he sits down on some steps, and he's alone, and the clock strikes midnight, and there's a chime. There's this great chime that goes off, and suddenly this car pulls around. It's an ancient car. It's this old car. And there's a chauffeur driving it. It's like a limousine, an old limousine. Beautiful old car from the early 20th century. And it's a limousine, and the chauffeur says, "Sir, would you like to get into my car?" He's like, And the chauffeur is dressed in period clothing from the early 20th century. And here this gentleman is in the early 21st century. So he walks over, and he opens the back door, and there's people in there like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and both Fitzgeralds, and Salvador Dali, and Gertrude Stein, one of my favorite historical figures, and F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife, and they welcome him in, and they're all in period clothing, and they're smoking cigarettes, and they're drinking, and they have him come into the limousine, and they take off, and suddenly this gentleman finds out that he's in the early part of the 20th century. He's with these great artists, Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Stein, and strong personalities, and really, really grounded in their own truth, and very idealistic. These great artists who lived in the early part of the 20th century. And the odd thing is and it's such an odd picture that Woody Allen gives us. He's in this limousine. These people are in period clothing, those absolutely beautiful clothes that men and women wore the early part of the 20th century. And he's wearing, 21st century clothes, kind of casual. And there's a mismatch there, but they don't seem to notice it. And he seems to, even though his language is different than theirs, they all kind of come together. And they begin to have conversations. And so the way the movie goes is that he goes back night after night after night, and the limousine always shows up at midnight, and he gets into it, and he goes off to a party where all these early 20th century artists and writers are. And he hangs out with them, and he talks with them, and he has these great conversations. And he explores these ideas. And so there's a part of him that comes home. The early 20th century becomes his home. becomes familiar to him. But see, the whole idea of what Woody Allen is putting out there is that he is resolving his conflict. Because his conflict is, do I really want to be a writer who makes a lot of money, or do I want to be a writer? Do I want to be an artist? Do I want to struggle? Do I want to stand in that place of integrity? And ultimately, because Woody Allen always puts a relationship issue in there, at some point he falls in love with a woman who's in the early 20th century, so there's that whole conflict. And again, it points out the conflict that he's in around his current relationship. It's interesting, Woody Allen does this great piece of mythology that points out exactly what Holmes said when he said, it is through the revelation of the self to the self that one understands life. Why did Woody Allen make him so completely comfortable in the 20th century? So completely comfortable in those conversations? Because Woody Allen is saying there is a place within us that is home that we don't know about on a conscious level. It's there. It's part of our consciousness. Recently, I was reading a copy of Unity magazine. There's a woman by the name of Noelle Stern. She's a spiritual writer and editor. She's been with Unity Publications for years, and she's a poet and spiritual counselor. She tells a story about a couple decades ago. She was going to Columbia University, a student at Columbia University. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Columbia University, that's big. That's one of the finest schools in America. Columbia University, so let's think about this woman who, you know that when she grew up in school, she was like the A student. She was like the one who did all the work. She was like the one who reminded the teacher, you didn't give us homework, and those people I really liked. And she probably got all A's, and she was probably on the school newspaper, and she was probably on the debate team, and she was probably very driven, and by the time she was 13, she knew what she was going to do, and she was going to go to college, and not just go to college, go to Columbia University, And she knew what she wanted to do, and she was very driven, and very, again, we want to talk about this idea of intention, very focused. And we talk about it in metaphysics, being very focused, having intention, knowing exactly what it is we want to do. But, again, we are an interesting field of consciousness. We're an interesting pot of consciousness soup walking around. So one day, she goes into, and obviously this is pre-internet and stuff, a few decades back, she's going to Columbia University. So she has to do a term paper for a literature class. And from reading her article, I get the impression that her major at that time was not English or literature, it was something else. So, I got to take a literature class, And so she has to do a term paper for a literature class. So she, remember that Dewey Decimal System? Oh my God. Who can figure that out? How many of us, you go along the shelves and you find out you're in the wrong part of the building, and you're there for 2 hours. Okay. So she's following the Dewey Decimal System around this library, and with the assistance of librarians and stuff, she ends up going deeper and deeper and deeper into this building, this ancient, beautiful old building at Columbia University, going deep into the bowels of the library, the inner rooms. Those dank rooms, and she said, she'd walk in and she kind of coughed because there's some kind of dust or stuff in the air, that book stuff, that book slime. That just, don't you love that? I love used bookstores. I love that. You open it up and stuff flies out. So she goes into this dank place, and so she's doing her Dewey Decimal System, and she's the straight A student, and she's the driven student, and she knows what she's supposed to get, and there's one certain volume there. And she's looking, and she's almost zeroed in on it. She's almost there. And suddenly over here to the left on a bookshelf, these bookshelves that are crammed with books from the floor to the ceiling, she sees this thin volume in there. All she can make out is the color of the spine. It catches her attention. And maybe for the first time, in this highly driven type A personality, she leaves the Dewey Decimal System behind just for a moment, and she turns and she reaches for the book. And this book happens to be a volume of poetry from a gentleman by the name of Richard Wilbur, who's a 20th century poet. And she pulled it off, and she wasn't terribly into poetry, but she opened it up and started reading. And there were 2 lines in one poem that caught her attention. It said, "Step off assuredly into the blank of your mind. Something will come to you." This highly driven, highly focused person read, "Step off assuredly into the blank of your mind. Something will come to you." And she became very emotional. And she said, "Wow, I found home." And she grabbed that book. And she changed her major to English. And she has spent her life writing and editing for Unity magazine. And she is now a poet. And has been a poet throughout her life. Sometimes we in metaphysics will say, the universe showed me something. The universe wanted, Judy asked me a while back, she said, "What do you think the universe is trying to tell you?" And that's an interesting concept that we throw around in metaphysics, but I want us to be really clear in terms of new thought what that means. Because on the face of it, it can sound dualistic. It can sound like somewhere out there in the universe, something wanted us to hear or see or find something. And we come back to what Holmes said. When he said, "It is through the revelation of the self to the self that one understands life." And the reason Holmes felt that way was because of how it feels like home. The gentleman in Midnight in Paris, the woman in the library, it felt like I was home. So Holmes said, wait a minute. If that's how it feels, it's an inside job. So what is it that when we say that the universe brought me something, the universe revealed something, and what we mean in that, and the old-time metaphysicians, and I know we live in a computer age now, so our thinking has really changed. But the old-time metaphysicians used to talk about the clockwork of the universe. And what it meant by that was, if there is something within me that is looking, if there is a contradiction, a question, an idea, a larger sense of me that is looking somehow, imagine everything that it took to place that thin volume in that one place on that bookcase so that when I walked in to the inner library at Columbia University, I saw the book that caught my eye. Think about that. Everything that had to align to make that happen. The old-time metaphysician said it was like this huge mechanical mechanism in the universe that Spirit was saying, Andy, there is something within you. There is a revelation within you. There is a contradiction. There is a question. There is a wonder. There is a passion. And you are looking, and I will provide. And Spirit doesn't care what it is. It doesn't care if it's postage stamps. Doesn't care if it's poetry. Doesn't care if it's taxidermy. It doesn't care. It simply provides. And when Holmes and our metaphysical ancestors realized this, you want to talk about an emotional experience. You want to talk about the synchronicity it takes to hear one conversation, to read one book, to walk into one place, to see something, to play a note, to pick up an instrument, to have a conversation with someone out of the randomness of the universe that is absolutely perfect for what we need at any given time to really wind our watch, to float our boat, to turn us on. That's amazing. Holmes said, this universe just gives. It just gives. And this incredible passion that lived within the heart of a woman who one day allows her eyes to wander and see a thin volume that maybe didn't even belong there. Or for someone to allow themselves to live in the contradiction. See, that's really the story in Woody Allen's movie, is that this guy doesn't, it's just, it bothers me, I'm bored with it, I want to move beyond it, I don't really care, I have a good life. He said, no, there's something in me, there's a contradiction, there's a question, there's something that won't leave me alone. And to chase that down. To be willing to chase that down. To be willing to look beyond where we're supposed to look. To look outside the boundaries. To allow our eyes to wander. To allow our ears to wander. To allow ourselves to be drawn into a conversation or something that goes by on the radio or a piece of music or whatever. To allow ourselves to engage at that level. To open up to those broader areas that come from within us. And I was thinking this week about those times where it showed up in my life. And I remember speaking at college when I first went to Chico State. Oh my God, registration was a cattle call. It was a nightmare. You go into Acker Gym and it was just on. I mean, tables, thousands of people. And you felt like you were on the floor of the stock exchange. You're just trying to get your poli-sci class, And I remember I was in the middle of all that, and I needed a political science class, and I'm kind of wandering around, and there's these tables and people, and some of them were professors and some of them weren't, and they were signing people up for classes and all this stuff. And so I had my catalog, I had all my stuff, and I'm kind of standing there in the middle of this chaos, and I'm even trying to figure out where things are, and I needed a poli-sci class. I wasn't even sure if I was in the right area. And this old grizzled, colorful old guy was sitting behind the table. Nobody was there. Hey kid, you looking for a poli-sci class? Yeah, come on over. He goes, I want this class to make it, and if I don't get some people signed up, they're going to cancel it. What is it? He says, well, it's the politics of change. It's about revolution. That sounded cool to me. Whatever. I just needed a class. So I signed up. And it turned out to be one of the most profound classes I ever took, because it laid the groundwork for what I stepped into in this philosophy, because it was about change. It was about the evolution of how politics and society changes. It was about revolution. It was a great class. And the guy who taught it was just this amazing person. He showed up drunk at 10 in the morning, but he was incredible. He was great. And when he was sober, he wasn't so good. And I wrote this, one of the best term papers I ever wrote in my life. I only got a C on it, but he was tough, but it was great. It opened me up to how change takes place, and how revolution takes place, and how out of chaos can come so much beauty and things like. It was just this incredible class. And when I look back at my life, it had nothing to do with my career. It has nothing to do with anything except everything, because it opened me up for this philosophy years later, with the idea of how change takes place. With the idea of out of the ashes comes up great ideas, and how competing ideas and moving beyond paradigms and moving beyond belief systems and moving beyond political ideologies, and I was able to relate so much of that to my own personal life as a person, not as a country or anything, but how we have to move beyond our ideologies, how we have to move beyond our paradigms, and how change takes place, and how all of that. And I remember that's really where the seeds of that started in my thinking. In terms of this, hey kid, you looking for a poli-sci class? And I remember as a kid, I'm a cartoonist, and I remember, I've never made my living at cartooning. I'm not famous at it. Nobody's ever going to hear about me, but I've spent my life doing it. I've done a lot of interesting things. And I remember it started as a little kid in a newspaper, and I used to love the comics, and I loved the editorial cartoonists, even though I didn't understand them. And there was a guy by the name of Schumacher. That's how he signed his work. And I remember the newspaper my parents took every day, he was on the back page of the front section. And I would get that paper, and because I remember the first time I saw it, there was something about his art, there was something, and I never saw the world the same way. I have no idea why, but I felt like I'd found home. Years later, another cartoonist by the name of George Baker caught my attention, and I found home. I was looking at some of my own work the other day, and I realized that those two people, some of their styles still bleed through my work today. I found home, you know. Neither one of them were Charles Schulz, neither one of them were Al Capp, neither one of them were the Hall of Fame cartoonists. I've gone online to look at who Schumacher was. He was a 20th century cartoonist. He was okay. He was syndicated. I remember when I found his work online, they had some examples of it again. I almost cried. I said to my kid, looking at a freaking political cartoon. Because it was like coming home. It was like coming home. Ernest Holmes says in his work, again, The Science of Mind, it is through the revelation of the self, to the self, that one understands life. This happens through the power which is at the heart of God. And this comes through a recognition of the unity of the individual with Spirit. So basically what Holmes is saying is that when we have this experience, we are recognizing Spirit. Whether it's a song, a cartoon, a class, a conversation, a book, a piece of music, whatever it is. It's the ultimate namaste. It is. It's the ultimate namaste. Wow, this place in me recognizes this place in this. And I'm somehow connected. I'd like to end today with a little bit of a meditation, a guided meditation. I'd like to invite you, if you're comfortable, to close your eyes for just a moment. And just allow yourself to turn away from the activities of your life. And we all have such wonderful lives, such full lives, and just to turn away for just a moment. To just allow ourselves to drift in and to become fully present right here and right now. To feel how you are supported in your chair. To know how you are supported in this community. And just allow yourself to take a deep breath and to nourish your body. Taking in the sustenance of life, the sustenance of Spirit. I would invite you to imagine for just a moment a place that is familiar to you. It could be your home. It could be an outdoor refuge, a place where you really like to go. A specific room or a favorite place to sit and relax and contemplate. Just allow yourself to spend some time there just for a moment. Now I want you to take a moment to imagine all who come into that place and share it with you. Loved ones, beloved animals, a plant or a tree, a wild animal, an insect, a bird, these beloveds who share this space with you. I want you to imagine them as a Christ or Buddha. Like an icon that is alive, moving, sitting, standing, interacting with you. Taking in the same space that you're taking in and enjoying it. That space with you. Imagine this space as an altar. You are the icons on that altar. What objects are there? A book? A candle? Furnishings? Art? A musical instrument? A personal device of some kind? A phone? A computer? A periodical? A flower arrangement? What is being revealed back to you, from you, about you? What is being revealed back to you, from you, about you? What is being revealed back to you, from you, about you? Through this altar. This setting, these icons, these objects. What deep and profound awareness is waiting for your noticement of it? Waiting for your discovery. Waiting to be revealed. I would invite you to once again become aware of how you're supported, how you are safe, how you are loved in this place and in this community. And when you're comfortable, open your eyes and come back into the room.